So in 1556, on the abdication of his father Charles V, Philip II here became the King of Spain and ruler as well of the other assorted properties left to him. If you've learned your history in England or Holland certainly, or in pretty much any Protestant country, you probably regard Philip as one of the real bad guys in European history. John Lothrop Motley says that if Philip possessed a single virtue, it has eluded the conscientious research of the writer. If there are vices, as possibly there were, from which he was exempt, it is because it is not permitted to human nature to attain perfection even in evil. However, he has more recently been described by Stanley Payne as the hardest working ruler of his time and as sincerely devoted to what he saw as his duty. The Spanish have always thought of him as El Rey Prudente, the wise and prudent king who ruled Spain through much of its golden age. Almost immediately after he took over in Brussels after his father's abdication there, he was faced by a threat from Henry II in France, who proposed to seize Flanders, which he thought should be the French Netherlands rather than the Spanish Netherlands. This resulted in the Battle of San Quentin, the first battle of Philip's reign, about halfway between Paris and Brussels on August 10, 1557. We'll be seeing a lot more of the Escorial eventually, but the Spanish victory at San Quentin is commemorated on the wall of the Hall of Battles there, which you see now. Philip himself was not a great general, and I don't think he ever led the troops in his life. The leaders in charge of his army at the time of the battle were Emmanuel Filiberto of Savoy and Count Egmont. Philip at the time was nominally the consort of Queen Mary Tudor in England, so an English contingent also fought in this battle under Ambrose Dudley, the brother of Elizabeth's favorite Robert, about whom we heard last quarter. On the French side, several fellows were also involved, about whom we'll hear later, including Anne de Montmorency, the very manly fellow with the girl's name, who is usually blamed for the loss, and his nephew Gaspard de Coligny. Egmont, despite his effort on behalf of Philip at San Quentin, will go on to become one of his worst enemies, as we'll see, and Coligny and Montmorency will both go on to be major players in the French wars of religion, about which we'll also hear. This is a closer view of the wall painting of the battle now. Philip was certainly interested in the arts and brought many important paintings from the Spanish Netherlands to Spain, which are now in the Prado. He tried to get the greatest artists of the day to come and work for him, but he had little success. He made offers to both Michelangelo and Titian, but they were old men by this time and not inclined to leave Italy. So the Escorial, instead of being decorated by Michelangelo and Titian, was decorated by fellows more like, well, Cisco and Pancho, and no one considers the Escorial to be the Sistine Chapel of Spain. The conflict with the French was pretty much a one-battle war and was ended by the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559, by which the Spanish control of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Holland was recognized by France. As I mentioned, Philip II was the husband of Mary Tudor at the time of the battle, but she died in 1558, and to solidify the treaty with the de rigueur marriage, Philip then took the daughter of Henry II, Elizabeth of Valois, as his wife. This is a portrait of Elizabeth now by Sophonisba Anguissola, a woman now regarded as one of the most important painters of Philip's day. Elizabeth was actually Philip's third wife. His first wife, Maria of Portugal, was the mother of his son Don Carlos, who at 14 had himself already been betrothed to the 14-year-old Elizabeth here. It's hard to separate legend from history and what happened on the return of Philip to Spain with Elizabeth, but the story goes that Carlos resented his father's confiscation of his own intended bride, and that Elizabeth herself found Don Carlos more attractive than Philip, who at 31 was more than twice her age. This is a portrait of Don Carlos by either Sophonisba or Sanchez Coello, who was a personal friend of Philip's, and Philip was also the godfather of two of his children. A lot of literary mileage has been gotten out of what happened in the family in the next few years. A play by Schiller and an opera by Verdi have both dealt with the gossip, which, as I said, is hard to separate from the truth in this business. Don Carlos died in prison in 1568, possibly killed on the orders of his father, although that can't be documented. Philip, in any case, may have been less concerned about any Oedipal problems than he was about Don Carlos's political ambitions. Carlos was certainly in contact with Philip's enemies in the Low Countries and elsewhere, and there's no doubt Philip considered him wholly untrustworthy. One of the most memorable lines in European drama is spoken by Carlos in Schiller's play, when he says, "Ich habe kein Vater, ich bin ein Königssohn." I don't have a father, I'm the son of a king. Elizabeth of Valois was to become the mother of Philip's favorite child, his daughter Isabella Clara Eugenia, about whom we'll hear as the friend and patron of Peter Paul Rubens in a few weeks. This is the Escorial now, about 25 miles northwest of Madrid. The building of the Escorial was another indirect consequence of the Spanish victory at San Quentin. During a battle, a church dedicated to San Lorenzo was accidentally destroyed by the Spanish, and August 10th, the day of the actual battle, was even the saint's feast day. So Philip had vowed to replace the church, which he did, only here, not at San Quentin. He had also promised his father to build a fit place for his tomb, which this would also supply. The choice of the location might seem puzzling at first. Ferdinand and Isabella had favored Granada, where they're buried, and Toledo was viewed as the traditional capital of Spain, but this is near neither. Philip had no interest in Granada. I'm not sure he ever visited it, and although he claimed to be as Catholic as anybody, he seemed to have felt that Toledo was too much the bailiwick of the church to be his own capital. But the church was certainly to be a big part, physically and spiritually, of the Escorial. San Lorenzo is the center of the whole complex, and an entire wing was given over to the Hieronymite order, which had been favored by his father and which had run the monastery to which he had retired, of course, at Yuste. A fine library was also put over the entrance at the front, we'll see later. Philip's own apartments were very unpretentious, as we'll see next week. The Bourbons later turned one wing into a Versailles-like place, but that owes nothing to Philip. Here you get a better look at the facade now. It was begun by the architect Juan Bautista de Toledo in 1563 and took about 30 years to finish, although Philip was living here long before that. Juan Herrera, who succeeded Juan Bautista de Toledo at the latter's death in 1567, was the actual architect during most of the construction. It's often said that the Escorial has much the character of Philip II himself. It's dour and serious, with nothing frivolous about it. Juan Bautista de Toledo had studied in Italy and assisted with the work on St. Peter's, which probably gave him the idea for the dome, which we'll see on the church here. But no one would mistake this for an Italian building. The only classical motif, really, is the colonnaded entrance. We're going to see a little bit more of the Escorial now, although it will be a while before we actually go inside. And we'll hear a piece of organ music by Antonio de Cabezon, who was the blind organist of San Lorenzo in El Escorial in Philip's day. Thomas Luis de Victoria is usually regarded as the greatest Spanish composer of the day, but he spent a lot of his time in Rome. Cabezon was really the first important Spanish composer for the keyboard. It's probably fair to call him Philip's friend, and he traveled with the king to the Low Countries and to England when he was married to Mary Tudor. The organist in this recording is Paulino Ortiz, who was, at the time of the recording, the organist at El Escorial, San Lorenzo in El Escorial. The organ he's playing, though, is the one in the Church of Santa Maria in Daroca. And this is one of the oldest organs in Spain. It's essentially a 15th century organ that was already old then in Philip II's day. It has a kind of reedy, rustic sound, which is very different from the kind of brassier sound of more modern organs. you're looking at the Escorial from the east. Off the southwest corner of the whole complex, there's a hospital which was built at the same time, and the so-called convalescence gallery there is one of the most elegant parts of the whole place. Looking west along the north side of the Escorial. This is the wing that was turned into the Versailles Palace of the Bourbons in the 18th century. And now you're facing the Church of San Lorenzo in the center of the whole complex. This portrait of Philip II is by Titian. As I mentioned earlier, Philip was no great charismatic leader of men. He was, as it were, more presidential than royal in character, and a man who loved bureaucracy, administration, and paperwork in all its forms. So in 1571, when the Turks and their fleet were threatening Italy, large pieces of which had been part of Philip's inheritance, Philip turned down another chance to be El Rey Glorioso instead of El Rey Prudente, and sent his half-brother Don John, or Don Juan of Austria as he's known, to lead the Christian fleet, which would also include ships from Genoa, Venice, and the Pope in an effort to re-establish Christian control of the Adriatic. The Turkish and Christian fleets met off the west coast of Greece in what was then known as the Gulf of Lepanto and is now called the Gulf of Patras. The Battle of Lepanto, which resulted, was one of the biggest sea battles ever. Each side had in the neighborhood of some 300 ships and about 40,000 men or so, around half of whom were rowing the boats. It was the last big battle to be fought primarily by oared galleys. This is a full-size replica of El Real, Don John's flagship at Lepanto. It's in the Barcelona Maritime Museum. The Christian fleet's victory here is sometimes blamed for the defeat of the Spanish Armada 17 years later. The claim is that it led the Spanish to maintain confidence in Mediterranean-style naval warfare, even when it was no longer appropriate. There weren't many oared galleys with the Armada that attacked the English, but the Spanish nevertheless wanted to grapple with the English ships and fight hand-to-hand, and the English just wouldn't accommodate them. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, the commander of the Armada, specifically said that that was what caused his colossal defeat. The English would not grapple and just backed away and continued to blast the Spanish with cannon fire. At Lepanto, it was a different story, however. In this picture, you're looking more or less across the Gulf of Patras, where the battle was fought. This is a painting of the battle by someone who wasn't there. It's Veronese's work in the Doge's Palace in Venice. At the outset of the fight, the Venetian commander Agostino Barbarigo was killed, and here you see him pleading the Christian case to the heavenly host. And it does look like the Virgin is saying something like, "I'm doing all I can." Many other famous families were also represented at Lepanto. The Genovese commander was Gianandrea Doria, the Pope's commander was Marc Antonio Colonna, and in addition to Don Juan, the Spanish were also represented by the Marquis of Santa Cruz. painting of the battle by the Venetian Vicentino. The Venetian flagship is in the foreground, and Marc Antonio Colonna on one of the Pope's galleys is behind. Tradition says the battle ended in just the way Hollywood likes to script this kind of thing. The galley of Ali Pasha, the Turkish commander, and that of Don Juan grappled, and the two heroes like Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone fought hand-to-hand over the decks until Juan killed Ali and waved his severed head around on a pole. In the armory of the Doge's palace you can see a trophy of the victory, a banner said to have been taken from the Turkish flagship. I don't read Arabic, but you can be sure that the sense of this is something like, "Go Muslims, beat the Christians." And this is the banner which was hung from the mast of Don Juan's flagship, El Real. This was, of course, a Catholic Christian victory. Few Protestants were involved, and more than a few would probably actually have preferred a Turkish victory. Many Protestants did, however, rejoice at least at the defeat of the infidel, if not at the victory of Spain and the Catholics. The Protestant James I of England, though, did praise the Spanish for their victory in a long, bad poem he wrote about the battle. This is a portrait of the hero of the moment now in Spain. This is Don Juan of Austria, Philip II's half-brother, as I said, the illegitimate son of Charles V and a German woman named Barbara Blomberg. Philip certainly had to be pleased about the outcome of the battle, but he never showed any public emotion about anything. In fact, he probably regarded the heroism of Juan with a jaundiced eye as a bit of a mixed blessing, and would have preferred to have had him die gloriously in the battle, I think. Juan was everything Philip wasn't: young, handsome, brave, charismatic, and not at all interested in paperwork. He was also very ambitious, and even entertained among his fantasies the idea of marrying Mary Queen of Scots and making himself the King of England. In 1576, Philip did give him an important position as governor of the Spanish Netherlands, but this was a job that Julius Caesar and Napoleon combined probably couldn't have done well. And Juan was doomed to be one in a long line of Spanish generals to die slogging through the mud after William the Silent and the Protestant and nationalist rebels there. I should perhaps mention that he's not the model for the many fictional Don Juans, from Tirso de Molina's play all the way up to Mozart's opera and beyond. This is his tomb in the Escorial. Some think that if Don Juan or Santa Cruz had lived to lead the Armada, things might have gone differently, but that's a little hard to imagine. Don Juan may be the greatest soldier to have fought at Lepanto, but he is not the most famous. That honor goes to Miguel de Cervantes, who wrote, in fact, quite a long eyewitness account of it that is part of Don Quixote. Cervantes actually fought with the Genovese contingent, having been forced to leave Spain for dueling. He was wounded in the fight and then captured by pirates on his way back to Spain, held for ransom that was finally raised by his family, perhaps with some help from the Trinitarians. He didn't return to Spain until 1580. This is the Escorial Library. Philip's favorite author was St. Teresa of Avila, about whom we'll hear more next week. But he may well have read Cervantes' first success as a poet, which was a series of poems in honor of Elizabeth of Valois. He was a lover of books in any case, and the Escorial Library still has many which he inherited from his father. Philip was himself an author of sorts and wrote an 18-volume history of Spain, which has, I think, never been published. He didn't read Don Quixote, though, because that wasn't published until 1605, several years after his death. Philip even acquired many books in Hebrew and Arabic. The general English and Protestant view that Spain was a grim place to live under Philip II and the Inquisition and all is especially difficult to reconcile with the fact that Don Quixote was wildly popular and has always been considered the greatest work in Spanish literature. Spain is, in fact, I suppose, the only country to have a comedy as its greatest work by its greatest writer. The Divine Comedy is, of course, not a comedy in the same sense. No one laughs reading that. The success of Don Quixote is all the more interesting since it makes the role models the Spanish respected most, knights in shining armor, aristocrats, heroes, look silly. When Don Quixote and Sancho, his immortal, worldly-wise sidekick, are leaving an inn, and the latter worries about who's going to pay the landlord, Don Quixote just says, "Don't worry, we heroes never have to pay for anything." When they get in a fight, he tells Sancho not to help unless he only hits men of his own low class. And he thinks guns are bad things because they allow worthless peons to kill noble gentlemen. When Cervantes returned from his adventures at Lepanto and thereafter, he eventually got a job in Seville helping to provision the fleet in preparation for the attack on England. But when some inexplicable eccentricities appeared in his bookkeeping, he was jailed where this plaque now marks the spot on the Calle de la Sierpe. And since he says at the beginning of the book that one may imagine it begun in some dark prison, it may well be that this is where he started writing it. When it was published, he was living in this house in Valladolid with his wife, several of her relatives, and an illegitimate daughter. And he may have wished he were back in jail in Seville, I think. As I mentioned, he makes fun of the Spanish role models and really of the whole Spanish worldview and the king himself. If there were ever a king who took what's come to be called a quixotic view of the world, it was Philip II. Don Quixote thinks windmills are giants, that chamber pots are war helmets, and attacks the dolls in a puppet show. Philip thinks that England will welcome him as a savior from the ogress Queen Elizabeth, and that if he just finds the right general, the Dutch will be defeated in the Netherlands. No one can see a windmill in La Mancha, of course, without thinking of the Knight of the Woeful Countenance, which might incidentally also describe Philip II. As Don Quixote lay in the dust, having been flattened by one of the mighty arms of the giant enemy, he turned to the agitated Sancho and told him to calm down because the fortunes of war are liable to frequent fluctuations. And this kind of engaging, if unrealistic, optimism is a large part of what makes him such an attractive character. Between 1612 and about the time of his death in 1616, he lived on the Calle de las Huertas near the Plaza de Santa Ana in Madrid. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. The poet's eye bodies forth the forms of things unknown and gives to airy nothingness a habitation and a name. How easy does imagination suppose a bush to be a bear? That's the way Cervantes' contemporary Shakespeare put it, but Cervantes might well have written those lines himself. Legend, in fact, says that Shakespeare and Cervantes died on the same day in 1616, but that's apparently not true. This is the Trinitarian monastery in Madrid where Cervantes is buried. I'm not certain why he was buried here, but as I mentioned earlier, the Trinitarians were involved in getting him loose from his kidnappers after the Battle of Lepanto. In a way, I think Don Quixote can be taken as a kind of commentary on genius. Saint Teresa, El Greco, Don Quixote, they just don't see the world the way the rest of us do. And that allows them to give us a new vantage point, unique perspectives. This can make them seem bizarre on a first encounter, but genius has a way of eventually winning us over for the long term that mere eccentric quackery doesn't possess. This is a portrait of Cervantes by a fellow named Juan de Arregui. It's in the Madrid Royal Academy of Literature. I do think that to some extent the success of Don Quixote was actually due to the fact that it really is, in a sense, the very sort of thing it's making fun of. It's a wildly imaginative, romantic adventure story full of the kind of fantasy that has been popular since antiquity. Another thing that should perhaps be touched on here is the fact that although Cervantes' father was a well-educated physician, and he was born, Cervantes himself, in the university town of Alcalá, there's no evidence that he had any formal education. I bring this up because, of course, the most fundamental argument used by those who think Shakespeare couldn't have written his plays goes that he didn't have the education to do it. In fact, Shakespeare and Cervantes are hardly unique among literary geniuses, as I mentioned last quarter, in lacking formal education. The list of those who had less formal education than one might expect includes people like Molière, Dante, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Mark Twain, Hemingway, Steinbeck. There's not a college graduate in the group. Geniuses can educate themselves. This has always looked to me like a portrait of someone who was required to have his picture painted rather than of someone who just paid for it out of vanity. I'm not sure that would be evidence for or against it being a portrait of Cervantes. Writers as a class aren't known for being more modest than other people, but the subject is traditionally identified as Cervantes in any case, and the picture is by El Greco, so if it is Cervantes, that makes it a very interesting work of art. It looks like Cervantes ought to look to me, and there's at least a sort of vague resemblance here to the picture of him in the Royal Academy of Literature, which we just saw. No one can read Don Quixote and not be impressed by the author's erudition, however acquired. Cervantes was obviously a voracious reader and says as much. He says he even read the scraps of paper he found on the ground. He blames, in fact, Don Quixote's condition, his eccentricity, on the fact that he reads too much, which suggests a kind of autobiographical connection to his hero. And I do think there is a lot of Cervantes in Don Quixote. That probably would go without saying. Every great writer has to put a lot of himself into his protagonists, I think. Don Quixote was certainly, Cervantes, certainly a knight-errant of a sort himself, and had a lot of the kinds of adventures fantasy heroes have. Among great authors, he certainly lived one of the most exciting lives. Well, whether or not this is actually Cervantes, it is a portrait of someone by El Greco, the greatest painter in Spain during Philip's reign. He was not, as you probably know, though, Spanish by birth. He was born on the island of Crete in 1541 and was known to his parents there as Dominikos Theotokopoulos. By 1568, he was in Venice practicing as an artist, and in 1570, he moved to Rome. And it was probably in Rome that El Greco painted this picture of Christ healing the blind now in the New York Metropolitan Museum. El Greco is always called a mannerist, and that term is even more difficult to define than most terms used by art historians. The fact that El Greco and Tintoretto, whose work he would have seen all over Venice, are always considered the most important mannerists certainly can tell you something about the style. Their pictures are theatrical, often action-packed. They often depict strong emotions that are meant to excite them. Mannerist painting also often contains unusual, sometimes jarring colors that, especially in the work of El Greco, are said to be kind of acidic or metallic in character. Much of this kind of language can be used to describe a lot of Baroque art also, and Mannerist and Baroque art do have a lot in common. Date has something to do with the use of these terms too. Mannerism is usually regarded as a kind of transitional style between the Renaissance and the Baroque, and its heyday is the late 16th and early 17th centuries. About the time El Greco painted Christ healing the blind here, he left Rome for Spain. His career was going nowhere in Rome, and he was already 36, middle-aged by the standards of the day. Some say he had to leave Rome because he'd made everyone angry by offering to repaint the Sistine Chapel. In any case, he'd made the acquaintance of Luis de Castilla, whose father Diego Castilla was head of the cathedral chapter in Toledo, and who encouraged him to go to Spain, where there weren't many important artists, and where Philip II was looking for artists to work at the Escorial. El Greco, the Greek, as he now came to be known, took Castilla's advice and moved to Toledo, where his father, Diego Castilla, was probably instrumental in arranging to have him do the espolio, the disrobing of Christ, for the vestuario of the cathedral, where it can still be seen. completed this in 1579, and it is always regarded as one of his most important accomplishments. This has pretty much the whole Mannerist personality. That typical Renaissance work is very emotionally restrained, and this has the Mannerist emphasis on the theatrical. The eyes rolling up to heaven, the hand on the heart, the clashing colors, the juxtaposition of the pink and yellow almost hurts the eyes, and it certainly has the character of a painted vision. Everything seems to be sort of suspended in space. Another feature of the Mannerist style is, in fact, the tendency to neglect landscape, and certainly in most of El Greco's pictures it plays a minor part in the overall effect of the composition. Several things about the picture worried the church. The brightness of the robe, for example, and the fact that the heads of Christ's tormentors are above his own, which was thought disrespectful. Also, the Virgin at the lower left bore a suspicious resemblance, it was thought, to El Greco's mistress Hieronyma de las Cuevas. Maybe most worrisome of all was the fee he requested, though, at around 5 times what the cathedral chapter wanted to pay. Eventually, the church did accept the picture, and El Greco accepted a lower fee, but this was not the last time this quintessential painter of religious intensity would show that he was no monk himself. So next week then, we'll go on with the career of El Greco, see more of the Escorial, and then hear about Philip II's problems in the Spanish Netherlands, where Peter Bruegel will be painting.